right. These are all talked about looking back because we are in a Mercury retrograde. And last night we talked about looking back while looking forward, which is what recapitulation is. When you recapitulate, you're going over what you did before, and even though you're going forward, it's a backward looking. And we're going to continue that a little bit tonight, and then at the very end we have another kind of looking back or a backward movement. And that will about be the end of it, and tomorrow night will all be about retrospection. Now, in the book of Titus, Paul says, who gave himself for us, that he might redeem us from all iniquity and purify unto himself a peculiar people, zealous of good works. Those are beautiful words. I don't think I could write a letter that beautiful. They're also inspiring words, and they are promising words. But there is one word in particular in them that is of interest, and that word is peculiar. Now, at the time of the King James translation, the word peculiar had a different meaning than it does today. It didn't mean unusual or different. Paul was not saying we were a bunch of weirdos. The word most likely meant exclusive or separate or set apart. Now, at the time of Paul, the Christians were a very small minority in the Roman Empire. And it is to that separation and the fact of that they were a sect of high morals and belief was very different from those of the majority. Now, as Rosicrucian students, we are also a very small group. And our situation is that our morals and our ethical aspirations, we also tend toward purity. I can't remember if I've ever lived in Rome or in the Roman Empire, but I suspect that our differences from our society are less great than the differences of the early Christians to the other Romans. In fact, I sometimes have a difficult time to distinguish us from the rest of society. And I think we all labor under that difficulty from time to time. And I wonder if any of you have ever asked yourself this question: how are we and our lives different from those around us? How are we and our lives different from those around us? I don't think it's a matter of intelligence. Most of the people I worked with were much more intelligent than me. I don't think it's a matter of taste or style or ambition or sociability or anything like that. In almost all respects, it would be difficult to differentiate any one of us from society in a meaningful way. We all have families, we all suffer, we have illnesses and we have losses and we have hopes and we have dreams, and in those things we're no different than anybody else. Nobody can say that we have a corner on love or generosity or any other positive trait. The only significant difference that I can see for us from the rest of society is consciousness. We are extremely blessed people in the consciousness of knowing in what we are participating. By far, the vast majority of humanity in our society doesn't even have much of an inkling of what we're participating in. Now, most of us make the mistake of thinking that we know more than we actually do. We intuitively assent to the content of the Rosicrucian CosmoConception, but we don't know it in the way that we know the way how to get across town, and we confuse belief and intuitive experience, and we don't prove all things. On the title page of the very first Rosicrucian CosmoConception, it said, "Prove all things." We don't do that. And we do very little in applying Rosicrucian philosophy, and even less in extending it. But despite all of those flaws, we are really blessed to have even the vague understanding of what we are fortunate enough to participate in. It's almost as if we should be singing paeans of gratitude from morning until night. We should have that kind of joy just for knowing what we know or intuiting what we know. Now, an intuition is a moment of spiritual knowledge. And being spiritual, that moment is timeless, or it's completely full of time, depending on how we understand time. Most of the time we're not in those intuitive moments, but instead we're in our memory or our conceit, and we form the illusory notion that we really are in an intuitive state all the time. And when we do this, we hinder our progress in soul growth. Consciousness is now. It's not a memory. It's not what we hope. It's now. And consciousness is our duty. If we want to appeal to authority, the Rosicrucian CosmoConception tells us that waking objective self-consciousness is the central goal for us in the evolutionary creation. That is our duty. That's what it's all about. It's mentioned in other parts of the writings of Max Heindel. And this is why we do our spiritual exercises. We want to become more conscious. And we want to maintain that consciousness continuously. We want our intuitions to hang on forever if possible. When we learn to leave our dense bodies, when we have enough soul to do that, there will be no loss of consciousness to sleep. And there will be no loss of consciousness to death. So, let's look at consciousness in looking back fairly near where we left off in the talk last evening. We were looking back while moving forward, and that's called recapitulation. The most common example of evolutionary recapitulation in humans is in the womb. It's undeniable. In the womb, we recapitulate a surprising amount of the evolution of form. The evolution of form on this material earth, which is a recapitulation of an even bigger kind of evolution. At some stages in the womb, we even have gills, like fish. However, prenatal experience is not accessible to most of us. We don't have that kind of consciousness that we can remember it. And the incoming entity is often not conscious of it. The next most obvious example of evolutionary recapitulation is in the developmental periods after birth. The 7-year periods after birth are called climacterices or climaxes. Now, that term isn't used very much at all, and when it is used, it relates to only 2 of the 7-year periods, the one at puberty and the one at menopause. At puberty, it's called the lesser climacterix, and menopause is called the greater climacterix. Now, the Rosicrucian CosmoConception tells us that the first climacterices are recapitulations of the first 4 periods of our evolutionary career. The first 7 years represent the Saturn period, when we began the development of form that has now, after many, I don't know if you can even say billions of years, is now our dense physical body. So this is a recapitulation of a mineral-like existence. And the minerals to this day are ruled by Saturn. In caring for infants, Saturnine activity, like touching and touchy-feely things, are very important for an infant. Now, you could say that the first year of life, which is the first year of the Saturn period, is the Saturn revolution of the Saturn period. Obviously, the second year of life would be the Sun revolution of the Saturn period. And if you look at a developing infant with this in mind and with the horoscope, you can get some idea of what is important in development or redevelopment of the incoming entity and its personality. But there are all sorts of things. You can look at it astrologically and it helps, but there are all sorts of other things in there, so that it gets pretty complex to try to do that. In a similar manner, the second climacterix is a recapitulation of the Sun period. And children shoot up like plants, and the proportions of the various regions of the body change. I think it is a 2, 3, 4, 5. I think that the difference between the adult body and the infant's body is that the head is twice as large and the thorax or the trunk is 3 times as large, and the arms 4 times and the legs 5 times. I'm not sure on that, but that's usually the way the proportions grow. So we can educate and train children in this period using repetition. The vital body thrives on that, and that's the best way to work with education. In a similar manner, the third septenary period of development is a recapitulation of the moon period. In that period, the desire body was commenced in humans, and when it is reborn in humans in puberty, children become romantics. You listen to teenage songs that are tremendously romantic. And the moon period was itself recapitulated in the Lemurian epoch of the 4th revolution of the Earth period. And that's when we rebelled. And so when we find our teenagers coming to that age, which is a recapitulation, they rebel also. The mind is reborn around 21, near the beginning of the fourth 7-year period. And I can remember that fourth 7-year period because I'm extremely mental, too mental probably for my own good. And it was as if I was discovering a new philosophy every few months. And at this time in our evolution, the threefold spirit is beginning to focus through its vehicles from within. That is because the spirit is drawing itself into the concrete mind and through the concrete mind into the other vehicles. Eventually it'll penetrate all the way through all of the vehicles and will be really something. Of course our bodies won't be anything like this now. So it's for this reason that at the age of 21 we say a person has reached majority. And a person is then considered sufficiently mature to make sound decisions for itself, like whether or not it should avoid the draft. Plato would have had it majority be much later. He would have had it be somewhere around age 28 when the self is beginning to awaken to itself. It would probably be better, but we're way too impatient for that. Now, it's interesting to note that since we are in the middle of the fourth globe, of the fourth revolution, of the fourth period on Earth, and that each of those 7-year periods is a recapitulation of the great periods, this would mean that the age of our solar cosmos is reduplicated or in miniature reproduced between age 24 and 25. And there have been studies made that show that if an individual is going to be a scientist and they're going to make a great discovery, the signal discoveries of a lifetime are usually made between age 24 and 25. It's sort of like you're just in time with the cosmos. Now, these kinds of analogies could be made, we could carry it all the way deep into our life. But things become complex because there are always spirals within spirals. And some of the things are harder to discern. It's hard to tell when each part of the threefold soul is born. And it's even more subtle to determine when the attributes of the threefold spirit are born, which comes even later on in life yet. I'm getting to be of such an age now that I can sense that there are these inner changes taking place, and they're not necessarily because of something that I've done, but they just have something to do with the maturing of my inner consciousness. And I don't know what they all are and how they go, but I certainly appreciate it because I have a maturity now that I never had at all. I never even dreamed I could be this way, and that's still very little. Now, this is a very sparse presentation of this material. It's meant to demonstrate recapitulation as a factor even in our little lives. We're looking forward when we're going through the climacterices, but at the same time, we're going through what we have gone through before, so there is a kind of looking back. And I mention things like this not just to prove a thesis or to demonstrate a thesis, but to stimulate observation. Because if you do a lot of horoscopes, you could look at it astrologically, especially if you have children. And you can look into a lot of other things. Now, there's a lot of literature to read if you want to read on it. There's a whole educational system called Waldorf education that is based on what comes ripe at what time in these cycles. It's very fascinating and an excellent means of education. Now, if you choose to investigate more, I recommend that you do not lose yourself in a mass of information. This is a danger for us who are mental people. We get involved in philosophy, we get involved in ideas, and we get involved with information, and we sort of get spiritual indigestion because of that. It's something comparable to throwing a log on a fire that you just started with tinder. It's too much. So these are good things to do, but you have to exercise good judgment about how much you can take without blocking your development. Now, there are important things about spiritual living in recapitulation. Whether it is at the climacterices or in the individual variances to the climacterices that we each have, we learn things about our own application or misapplication at the critical junctures. There are times when the planetary principles behind the components of this scheme are obvious to us. And if we can see that and go with it, our lives can be much more efficient. At times, we see just how much we are living in the scheme, whether we're living it regeneratively or unregeneratively. These things come around again and again. So not only is the recapitulation a way to educate us by repetition and by gradually giving us very slight differences of viewpoint every time they come around, there's a great value in this, because even if we screw up somewhere along the way, we always get another chance. It's like the whole of the creation is a grace. And grace means giving somebody a break even though they don't deserve it. We didn't deserve the grace of Christ, but we get that kind of a break. Now, sometimes when we look back in recapitulation, things seem opposite, or they appear to be opposite from the original experience. So they're similar and opposite at the same time. And this is because the recapitulation takes a mirror image kind of thing. And we're going to come to something that we talked about a couple of talks ago. That is, at a stage of evolution, there is not only something that you're recapitulating, but there is something that is a reflection of what you did before. In the Rosicrucian system, you have the Saturn period, you have the Sun period, you have the Moon period, and you have the Earth period, which is broken into Mars and Mercury. And then opposite the June, again, across that vertical, opposite the Moon period is the Jupiter, and opposite the Sun period is the Venus, and opposite the Saturn is the Vulcan period. So there are reflections. What we do during the involutionary stage of the cycle, we take those things, and instead of just taking them into us, when we come to the evolutionary part, we throw them out of us, but we throw them out of us in a creative way. So when we're recapitulating something, even though we don't have Jupiterian consciousness, when we're recapitulating a Jupiter period of time, it's something like what we experienced in the lunar period of time, except that it is more outgoing rather than ingoing. So it seems the opposite. So there is this kind of reflection. And in jargon, we say that one period is a reflection of another period. Now, most of us at this time don't have the capacity to remember the moon period, nor do we have the capacity to anticipate the Jupiter period, because we're just too unevolved for that. But because of the analogous recapitulation in the cycles, we have a division or an axis of our lives where we reflect. The things that we do early in life are reflected to the things that we do later in life. This is why it's a really good thing to have little children be with older people. And why there are things that, when you're in the second half of life, there's that kind of a reflection. Now, this doesn't have to be intellectually heavy. And it doesn't have to be complicated. You can just say, oh, I remember that now, and I can see that, what it means. And if you have children, it can be just as simple as when you recognize one of these things with your own children, you strive to not make the same mistake. The mother of one of my godchildren, I got godchildren all over the place, the mother of one of my godchildren told me a story once that just blew me away. She said when she was a little girl, her mother would tell her things and say things to her in situations that she said to herself, I will never do that with my own children. And then a circumstance comes up and she blurts it out of her mouth, the thing that she said she would never do because the circumstance is so difficult and the only experience you have is the way you experienced it from your own children. So if we recognize these moments and we want to make progress, we have to really be on our toes and we have to really want to change, or we'll blurt it out just like my friend blurted it out. When we look at recapitulations in involutionary activity and our work in the evolutionary creation, in the septenary periods, we develop tools or principles of working with them. Oh boy, my notes are terrible here. And when we do that, we can come to some very basic means of working and dealing with them. Now, when we looked several days ago, we said that the retrospection in the postmortem was very different than the retrospection while you're in the body. Because in the retrospection, while you are in the body, you're always thinking about tomorrow. You're thinking, I want to improve myself for tomorrow. But after death, there is no tomorrow. And that allows you, when you make the retrospection, it allows you to see in the experience the things that were implanted in life, the events that were implanted in life that are signal to your individual development. And on top of that, those signal events represent very basic qualities of the different worlds in which the events take place. But I'm trying to say that, we work with the whole rainbow of desires in the desire world. For example, we have Saturn desires and Martial desires and Venusian desires and all of that. And sometimes when we see a key to our character in an event that we can't avoid in life, And if we recognize that in that post-mortem event, we not only know what is basic to our character, but if we can get behind that, we can understand, for example, the nature of martial desires objectively in the creative evolution. That's a horizontal kind of thing. You're recalling something that was built into you, and you're recalling something on a given plane of existence. There isn't much of a verticality to that. Now, that's one of the things that we can do with looking back. These moments or these principles that are the simple principles that are behind all of the creative evolution are the basis of everything in existence. We see them in our character development. We see them signified astrologically. The other kind of principles are those in products of our work in evolutionary creation. They are the principles of the worlds and bodies that correspond to what we do cosmological or character principles, and we see ourselves by looking back at our lives in astrological events. We see clearly which things are associated with which planets. And it's almost like taking a basic astrology course and looking at the description of the character and the principle and the purpose of each of the basic planets. Now, the more form-oriented principle is experienced at what could be called major or minor recapitulation points in life. Now, that is a very broad statement, and it's vague. It needs clarification. We know that there are spirals within spirals within spirals to many levels of depth. In the example we used earlier, speaking approximately, each year is the loop of a climacterics. At the end of the 7th year, the annular loop coincides with a major loop to the next climacterics. So at those points where a little loop connects with a greater loop, those are significant points. So what I'm trying to say here is that in recapitulation, the recapitulation when there is an alignment of principles due to the principle of analogy working in spirals within spirals, that is a significant time to find something important in your life. Now, each of us develops at a different rate, so it's not like we're looking at a mechanical clockwork. Though it is precise destiny-wise, we get just what we need when we need it. And so there are these points of greater and lesser significance. And they are symbolized in the CosmoConception by the caduceus of Mercury. These connected points should be right here. These are significant points. When the involutionary serpent meets the evolutionary serpent, and that happens abstractly in many points throughout life, those times in life are extremely important. Because at those points in life, you can not only understand things on the horizontal, like the principle between the moon period and the Jupiter period, but you can understand them vertically in the way that the spirit brings itself into matter. The diagrams that are in the CosmoConception about that show that symmetry across the vertical axis, and that vertical axis is between the higher and lower states. Unfortunately, it would have to be too complex of a diagram, but it doesn't show which attribute of the threefold spirit is reflectively projected in which vehicles and which periods. Now this is all just jargon. It's Rosicrucian lingo. It lacks clarification through experience. It's something that we have to be able to see and experience in our life if we want to have efficient spiritual lives. In these more significant recapitulatory moments, we can experience the evolutionary work in ourselves clearly. I can remember the place and the time when I had my first intuitive thought. It was way before I read the CosmoConception, but it was so exhilarating that I've been striving to be in intuitive thought ever since then. Now, just being aware that one is thinking or is emoting and what is entailed in that activity is spiritual growth. We live in ourselves all the time. And we go through different states of consciousness all the time. And very often, unless it's something very extreme, we don't realize when we're emoting or when we're thinking. And so to have the ability to objectify our activity and say, oh, that's desire, that is important. Because that is self-knowledge and that is understanding the reality of the cosmos in our own being. And when we can, the obvious crisis, if we get angry or something like that, it's clear then. But we should be able to do that all the time. We should be aware of what's going on in us. So sometimes we not only see that we are in desire, sometimes we see it in an archetypal sense. We say, oh, that is the very nature of desire. And we can say that we know then what desire is all about. And when we can do that and we can identify that and we can use that in our consciousness, that is when we are growing spiritually. And that is when we are doing our evolutionary work, which is based on the cosmos. We are a product of the cosmos. We are microcosmic miniatures of the cosmos. And so what happens in the greater cosmos happens in us analogously in some way. And the quicker that we can recognize it and live it out, the better it is for us. Now, this presentation is awfully mental. But we're not just talking about a mental exercise. We're talking about reality. And we're talking about reality in the deepest sense. It states as clearly can be that the first initiation is a Saturn initiation, and in that initiation, as you are opening up your spiritual sight, you relive at least some facet of your experience in the Saturn period. And you relive a more modern thing in the cycles within cycles within cycles of the Polarian epoch in the fourth revolution of the Earth period. And when you see that you are with the cosmos, and that you are part of it, you are so integral to the cosmos and you're self-conscious in it, then you are capable of being with the Creator or being the Creator in the cosmos. An initiate automatically is a creative being. An initiate is automatically a divine being. So we're not just talking about some mental exercise. Max Heindel describes it very clearly. He says sometime on a Saturday night you'll be reading this and you'll find suddenly that you are awake in the Saturn period, and that's the beginning of your first initiation. When we have that kind of a realization, we can serve more efficiently. We're not out of harmony. We're not bucking the system. We're not fighting nature. We're not fighting the evolutionary process. Now, most of us are probably not candidates for initiation any day now. But that shouldn't prevent us from practicing the process to improve our efficiency right here and right now. It's kind of a klutzy statement of it, but this is an indication of what we can do to be doing that. It's a blessing to have all of this laid out before us. Most people have no clue. Some people become so pure and they become naturals that they know what to attune themselves to and what works and doesn't work. And those are people that it's easy to initiate. But we have it right before us. We've been told what to look for. And if we have astrology and we start studying our own horoscope, it's a wonderful thing. All we have to do is recognize this in ourselves and live it out. And when we live it out, that means we step off of the recapitulation and into something new. We are then truly creative. Creation is always new, or it isn't creation. All right, that's as far as we're going to go with that. So let's take a few minutes and look at another way of backward movement in the Rosicrucian philosophy. And in doing this, we want to keep in mind that the philosophy is only valuable when it helps us to understand reality. Philosophy for its own end is worthless. You can get lost in it. You can be very knowledgeable about it, probably more knowledgeable than this talk. But what really counts is if a philosophy points toward reality and it urges you to live within reality. My understanding of this kind of looking back is maybe not very good. So we're probably going to struggle through this together. That's always how it works. We do the best we can with something, and our doing may be imperfect, but in the doing, we understand better what it is that we're working with. I've never known anybody to build a house where they didn't come away saying, if we built another one, it would be much better because we know what's at stake. And that's what we're talking about here, about presenting something that I really don't know anything about. In order to not be too jarring, let's try to be smooth about it and not so have a proper segue, as they would say in rhetoric. We are speaking of spiritual principles behind and within the evolutionary creation. These principles can be seen in a different way as ideals. And ideals are usually abstract. And because they're abstract, they are unattainable in the concrete. However, in trying to actualize them or make them real, that's where progress is made in the concrete. And then that progress in the concrete reflects back into the creative potency of the spirit. The disparity between the transcendent and the concrete causes some immature transcendental people to consider the concrete to be an illusion. There are a lot of things about concrete existence that are illusory, but it's not really an illusion. It is because by working in and through it, concretion awakens us and we become more knowledgeable, so that the illusory nature is helpful to us. Even pure illusions can help us understand how we function. If we take a spoked wheel, like a wagon wheel, and we set it spinning, and we gradually increase the spin of the rotation, eventually we'll reach a point where it looks like the spokes are going the opposite direction. It's an illusion because we're in control of the wheel and we know that which direction it is rotating. And what has happened is that the rotation has reached a speed at which the eye and the nervous system can't keep up with the motion. And it falls behind. And when you're seeing that illusion of the spokes going backward, that is a measure of your imperfection. Now, despite that illusion, the reality is that the wheel is still going forward. And because you have experienced that illusion, you know how you function. You know that there are limits to what you do, and you have an approximate idea what those limits are. Now, in one of the earlier talks, we talked about how the individuality, when it is in third heaven, or the abstract subdivision of the world of thought, that there is a moment of inspiration. And in that moment, the spirit knows itself. It knows the universal spirit in focus, which is God. And it knows itself as God, or as a God. And it knows, since the same idea that is the idea of God is the creation itself, you know yourself in or as part of the creation, the divine creation. And when we are filled with that knowledge and that experience, that inspires us. It inspires us so that we want to come back to birth and creatively work with it. And in doing that, we become creators. We create our new life. But because we are only journeymen, our creations are not perfect. There are a lot of errors. Then, when it comes to birth in the chemical subdivision of the physical world, what we have done is proved. This is our proving ground. The first years are developmental, and there is a founding of a new personality in the recapitulatory discussion that we've been, development that we've been talking about. Eventually, it is completely developed physically, and it is in its physical prime. What happens to our physical personality then? It starts to sink into decadence. It's inch meal at first, and then it's gradually increasing in acceleration. I look at my arms. This is a body in decadence, very clearly a body in decadence. And it isn't even a fun kind of decadence. Some people consider this some kind of a cruel hoax. That in materialistic reality for some people, that a third of life is to bring one to be mature, and then immediately they start going into decadence. You know they won't train jet pilots after age 28 because they're already, their reaction times and their reflexes are slowing. Now that kind of view is like looking at the illusionary spokes and thinking it is a reality. the reality is that life and consciousness is moving forward despite the decadence or despite the apparent backward motion. And retrogression, which is almost always totally in form, is not what it's about. In fact, much of our advancement is because of our failures or because of our decadence. When things don't work or don't work well, we suffer. And we suffer until we learn why. And then we learn experientially the nature of reality. Show me someone who has suffered, and I'll show you someone who has learned and grown. It may take until the next life before it bears fruit, but that's the way it is. We don't seek to suffer, and we don't intend to make mistakes, because that would be sick. But when we do suffer, and when we do make mistakes, we learn and we grow in earnest. It should break our heart to the fact that we are acting out of harmony with the divine cosmos. Now, the Rosicrucian Fellowship, in it is recommended that as we pass through life, and especially as we get to our later years, we note the imperfections in our bodies and the kinds of improvements that are needed, so that when we start building for our next life, we can build a body that doesn't have them in it. Now, this kind of looking back in time, with pondersome looking back on our children that we spoke of earlier in the talk, is different because it makes aging richer. It's not all just a matter of how great we are when we're coming to our prime. Now, the Rosicrucian CosmoConception tells us that everyone is capable of experiencing the baptism of the Holy Spirit and receiving that vision of the divine plan. Not only are we capable of it, it is our duty to do this. That's what evolution means. Now, we may have to be assisted when we are finding our way back to rebirth, because we are such poor creators. But even so, we do see the vision, and we seek the help of the recording angels and other divine beings who are only too happy to help us. However, there appears to be a principle of the proportion in the nearness between life waves and within life waves. I don't know how to say this. We can't eat minerals because we are too distant from that light wave. We can consume plants because they are closer, and we ought not to consume animals because they are too close. Of course, there are other reasons, and some of them are better, but we understand that there's this kind of proportion of distance of evolutionary distances. Now, at some ages, we don't take the influences from our parents because they're too distant, but we will take them from an older sibling because they are closer. Similarly, we model our lives proportionately on others whom we admire. However, because they are not as advanced because we're not as advanced as the ones that we admire, the form goes into decadence. Now, Max Heindel tells us that at his time, the being that was Socrates had developed the best of all human minds. And if you study a history of Western philosophers through their biographies, you see that many of them are little Socrates. They go through Socratic arguments and things like that. They are clearly modeling their lives, their consciousness, their philosophical outlook on Socrates. But they aren't Socrates. And so the Socratean things go into decadence. And that is a kind of going back or of looking back. We see a form that is devolving. I can remember when Jack Kennedy was president, Jacqueline had a hairdo that all the women wanted. But they weren't all Jacqueline Kennedys. And what happened was you had a lot of people that was almost a joke what they did. Now this is something that happens throughout creation. It happens when some people are not as good of creators as others. And by the way, I was one of those little Socrates guys, and I would look at it now, I see myself as having been a rather ridiculous person. The Rosicrucian philosophy teaches that this is a regular occurrence. New things come out in new editions. And they come out through a vanguard of creators. But other people who are not such good creators take the forms, but when they take the forms and use them to their own purposes, the form goes into decadence. But at the same time, the consciousness of those that are using the form rises. So you can see that this backward movement is accompanied by a forward movement in consciousness, and this is how progress takes place. So we can see that there are benefices in looking back at declining forms. One is learning through the decadence itself, and the other is advancement through degradation of a form or an ideal. And both of them move us forward. So it's a case where things going backwards are something that move us forward at the same time. Let's close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. O God, increase our love for Thee, so that we may serve Thee better from day to day. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in Thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. I see the hand going up already. I'm a little tired, I'm a little weary, but I will answer a question or two if you have one. All right. How long are you going to be in town? Are you going to be here tomorrow?
Yes.
Okay. Tomorrow night we're going to talk about retrospection. But maybe sometime we can find during one of the breaks during the day tomorrow, we can you can get that cell phone with all the questions on it.
What about tomorrow morning? How early can I be here?
Look at that, I dropped the chalk and it didn't break. My friend who is a folk comedian had a folk song about Abe the Schlemiel. And Abe the Schlemiel always did everything wrong. He was a klutz. And one day he dropped a piece of bread with jam on it, and it didn't fall with the jam side down. And he got the rabbi over there to show him, I am not a complete Schlemiel. And the rabbi looks down and says, you put the jam on the wrong side of the bread. Up for walking? Mark, you're up for walking, aren't you?
I don't know.
It's gonna be, I think it might be raining out there. Let me check.
Oh. Cheers. It's a little breezy.
No, it's not raining, and the sky looks pretty high.
It's been up there all day.
What? Oh, I still got this on.